I've been a defense journalist for more than a decade now, and one of the things about this line of work that a lot of folks don't always know about is how easy it can be to identify trends in what people believe just by reading through the comments. Every time I post a new video or article, I read through as many of the comments as I can, because I want to know if my work is resonating with you, but also because the conversations that go on under my work can often help me better understand public perceptions of the topics that we cover. Or to put that another way, if I see the same misconception or inaccurate account of events repeated over and over across different videos, articles, formats, and mediums, well, I try to take note because, well, those misconceptions, or even outright lies, become narrative barriers that I'll have to overcome when I cover those topics in the future. Now, some of the most pervasive myths about military technology are born out of the sheer complexity of modern warfare and the technologies that we employ within it. Others are based in the internet's love for a sexy headline, even if it isn't true. And a few of the most annoying ones just keep popping up over and over again because, well, some people really have trouble accepting the fact that World War II Germany wasn't run by technologically advanced uber-mench. So let's run through 15 of these military tech myths so that we can be sure that none of us fall prey to them in the future. I'm Alex Hollings. Welcome to Firepower. We've got a lot of myths to cover today, so let's dive right in with one of the most pervasive bad takes on the internet. The idea that small, inexpensive drones have made everything from tanks to fighter jets obsolete. Now, there is no denying that armed FPV drones, or small explosive-laden quadcopters, have had an immense impact on the battlefields of Ukraine, but it's also true that their efficacy in the fight and ability to absorb other roles beyond short-ranged intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance and infantry support have been hugely exaggerated. The videos you see on Twitter and Reddit may show tanks being destroyed by drones all the time, but the truth is, the vast majority of FPV drones never find a target at all, as little as 20% according to Ukrainian drone operators. And when they do, it almost always takes more than one to disable even very dated tanks and the like. In most cases, drones are used as the second round of a double tap, meant to take out armored assets, with the first and really effective one coming from much more cost-effective artillery. Now, don't get it twisted, small armed FPV drones will be a major threat on all battlefields of the future, but they won't be replacing things like fighter jets no matter how much Elon Musk thinks they should. And over time, they'll be mitigated by other defensive systems, making them just another tool in the warfighting toolbox that needs to be employed at the right time, against the right targets, to be truly effective. And while we're talking about overestimating the capabilities of modern technology, let's move on to myth number 2. The idea that spy satellites are omnipresent and capable of replacing intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, or ISR aircraft and spy planes. Now, the truth is, spy satellites, while incredibly valuable for the national defense apparatus, are still really limited and predictable. They just aren't anywhere near enough satellites in orbit to maintain constant surveillance over the whole world. And the satellites that we have are really predictable, flying along standard orbital flight paths that make hiding from them as simple as just knowing when they'll be overhead and tucking your secrets away until they're gone. Adjusting that orbital timeline could be done, but it means expending fuel, and with limited fuel on board, that also means any shift in trajectory or speed comes at the expense of the lifetime of a multi-billion-dollar asset. So it'd better be worth it if you're going to do it. And for proof that spy satellites aren't all-seeing, you need only look at American investments into ISR aircraft. Between 2000 and 2010 alone, the DoD increased its annual funding for unmanned aerial systems, or drones, by a factor of nearly 12. going from 384 million in a year to 3.3 billion, and producing many of the eyes in the sky that Uncle Sam now relies on for battlefield surveillance, like the MQ-9 Reaper, the RQ-4 Global Hawk, the RQ-170 Sentinel, and the highly secretive RQ-180. If satellites could do the job, that money would have gone somewhere else. It's really as simple as that. Speaking of money going elsewhere, our next myth is the idea that military technology is actually decades ahead of what we see on the commercial market, or even what's been revealed by the Pentagon. Now, to be sure, there are very likely a few specific circumstances where this is actually true, deep within the classified confines of DARPA facilities or in similar high-level programs manifesting in single technology demonstrators or prototypes. But the majority of the major hardware being employed by American service members is actually years and sometimes even decades old. And that's not just because defense acquisitions are slow, it's also because the commercial sector has giant piles of money to work with and doesn't need all of its gear to survive in the most harsh and hazardous working conditions on the planet. Aircraft like the F-22 and F-35 may seem incredibly advanced, and to be sure, they are compared to other fighters, but they are still platforms that were designed in the 1980s and 1990s that come equipped with computer systems that were already proven and considered hardy enough for the job all the way back then. The integrated core processor at the heart of the F-35's computational capabilities, as a great example, has less dynamic random access memory, or DRAM, than my iPhone. But to be clear, the TR-3 refresh is changing that, and new F-35s are a bit more computationally advanced. Nonetheless, while there is some truth to this myth, for the most part, the military's technology is anything but science fiction. Of course, we only know what we do about American military technology because the US and the West are generally very transparent about what they're doing with our money. And before you start typing your comment to say that isn't true, I'll ask you to look up the operational readiness rates for China's J-20 fleet, or how many testing failures Russia's avant-garde hypersonic missile has seen. That kind of information is readily available about American programs, but nowhere to be found from its geopolitical adversaries. That's the transparency gap. And that transparency really sets the stage for our next myth. The idea that classified information has ever been leaked in the War Thunder forums. War Thunder is a video game that pits users against one another in real military platforms, and that takes pains to deliver accuracy and realism in its depiction of those systems. And players have formed several large online communities in which they discuss and debate that realism. And because, trust me bro, is a quick way to lose a fight online, these people have a habit of citing their sources, which often means posting those sources online. And if that source is in any way restricted, a deluge of memes and headlines will follow about yet another War Thunder leak, because, well, those headlines and memes get a lot of clicks and shares. I dug through 30 alleged leaks from the War Thunder forums, including documents pertaining to the French and German Eurocopter Tiger, the British Challenger 2, the French Leclerc, the American F-15E Strike Eagle, F-16 Fighting Falcon, F-117 Nighthawk, and AH-64D Apache, Russia's MiG-29 and Su-57, and China's fin-stabilized armor-piercing Sabo rounds, just to name some of them, and in every case, the materials that were allegedly leaked were really just publicly available promotional materials, widely disseminated user manuals, and old outdated documents with no practical utility. The most egregious of these leaks involved restricted documents that were just subject to export controls. But understanding the nuances of ITAR, or the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, is hard, and just calling old unclassified documents top secret makes for much more engaging headlines. And speaking of stories that only exist because of bad media practices, let's talk about my least favorite military technology myth of all: the claim that Germany's Horten brothers invented stealth with their Ho 229 during World War II. Now, some of you already know that I have a full-length dive into the bad media that spurred this myth that I've had to fight to keep putting back up because the production company behind the documentary that really thrust this myth into the spotlight, called Hitler's Stealth Fighter, keeps trying to find ways to take my video down. The Horton brothers didn't invent stealth, or even flying wings. They were just amateur glider designers who convinced the increasingly desperate German government to pay for them to strap a couple newly designed jet engines to one of their gliders, in hopes of producing a long-endurance bomber. Instead, the Ho-229 killed its test pilot on just its third test flight and never got off the ground again. The Hortons were barely familiar with the concept of radar at the time, let alone stealth, and if you want proof of that, you need only know that Reimer Horton tried to get scooped up as a part of Operation Paperclip, and failing that, also approached both the UK and Chinese governments in hopes of continuing his work, and nobody wanted it. He ended up fleeing to Argentina instead, where he continued being a failed airplane designer until the late 80s, when word broke that America was building a flying wing bomber, and he wrote a book trying to take credit for its design. And because some people are just big fans of World War II Germany, they just refuse to let this myth die. And speaking of Operation Paperclip, our next military tech myth is the idea that the United States technologically dominated after World War II and ultimately won the Cold War, specifically thanks to the uber scientists that it recruited through Operation Paperclip. Now, make no mistake, the US absolutely recruited German scientists in droves at the close of World War II, with famous engineers like Werner von Braun among the 1,600 or so scientists that were brought to the States through this program, and I can't defend that. But this myth misunderstands America's scientific successes in the very same way it misunderstands the German accomplishments that came before them. German engineers aren't made out of different stuff than the rest of the human race. They don't have supernatural predilections for technological breakthroughs. What they had at the end of World War II was experience in these fields, born of the German government's investment into research and development in hopes of finding a way to turn the tides of the war. They weren't superhuman, they were well-funded. And when these scientists and engineers came to the United States and worked alongside thousands of other American scientists and engineers, they were even better funded. The secret to advancing military technology isn't Aryan brain cells, it's big piles of money. And for proof, just take a look at the Soviet equivalent to Operation Paperclip, which recruited nearly 1,000 more German engineers and scientists than Uncle Sam did, only for the country to collapse under the weight of an ineffective economic model. Okay, let's get back to the modern day for our next myth, which is the idea that aircraft carriers are obsolete in this modern era of drone warfare and long-range anti-ship missiles. Now, to be clear, carriers are indeed vulnerable to saturation attacks from large volumes of missiles, but the truth is, there aren't actually many nations on the planet that are even capable of getting a reliable target track on a carrier at sea, let alone ones that can launch enough long-range missiles with enough precision to mount an effective attack against what is, objectively, among the most heavily defended assets in the history of mankind. The Aegis combat system and interceptors employed by the US Navy surface combatants are arguably the most capable air defense apparatus on the planet today, and even 4 acres of flight deck represents a pretty small target against the massive backdrop of the Pacific Ocean. Carriers, like tanks and fighters, are going to change in the ways that they're employed and defended as new threats emerge, but there will always be value in well-defended floating airfields full of attack fighters that you can position anywhere on the globe. And while we're talking about fighters, like the Navy's F-35C, let's address another myth. The idea that detecting a stealth fighter means its stealth has been compromised or is even worthless. The truth is, stealth fighters aren't meant to go undetected so much as they're meant to avoid being targeted. Now, if it's feasible to remain undetected using the laundry list of technologies that fall under the umbrella of modern stealth, well, all the better. But detection is a long way off from actually being able to engage a stealth fighter or shoot it down. Different radar arrays broadcast across a wide range of frequencies for different applications. Higher frequency targeting arrays have the fidelity to actually guide a weapon into a target, while lower frequency early warning arrays are meant to provide advanced warning of incoming threats, but they lack the fidelity needed to actually guide a weapon. Stealth fighters, as you might imagine, are purposely designed to counter those high-frequency targeting arrays that have the potential to actually shoot them down. Lower frequency arrays can sometimes detect a resonance produced by elements of a stealth fighter's design that might be able to tip defenders off that the fighter is coming, but you still can't hit what you can't target. And speaking of shooting fighters down, let's talk about air defenses and how good we expect them to actually be. In our modern upvote, downvote culture, we've come to expect military hardware to work 100% of the time, or we dismiss it as bad. But war is one of the most complicated things that humans do, and that kind of polarized thinking is almost never useful in a fight. American air defense systems like Patriot, THAAD, and more have a combined intercept average in both testing and real-life engagements of 72% since 1963, according to a report compiled by the Nuclear Threat Initiative. And it's important to understand that that includes the early testing of new systems that are intentionally pushed to their failure points to identify platform limitations. Russia, on the other hand, has claimed a 100% success rate in their tests of modern systems like the S-400, which either isn't true or means Russia has a terrible testing apparatus because they're getting blown up all over Ukraine. Real expectations for modern systems, depending on the threat, can often fall somewhere in between that sort of 70 and 100% mark. But again, war is complicated and messy. Air defense is never a certainty, even with the best systems in the world. And that's why aircraft carriers still take evasive action when missiles are closing in. Not because their air defenses are faulty, but because even excellent air defenses aren't infallible. The truth is, even the Russian air defense assets that we've seen obliterated in Ukraine are pretty broadly considered to be competent systems. Air defense is just that hard a job. So, if you hear the siren telling you that missiles are inbound, don't open your lawn chairs next to your local Patriot battery and just hope for the best. It is always better to seek cover. Speaking of missile defense, let's dive into a military myth 2-for-1 in the form of hypersonic missiles. The first myth is that these weapons can't be stopped, and the second is that they're basically worthless. And I realize that's contradictory, that's the nature of the internet. Now, true modern hypersonic missiles travel at speeds in excess of Mach 5, but importantly, they're capable of maneuvering somewhat unpredictably at high sustained speeds to mitigate intercept. You see, air defense systems shoot down incoming missiles by calculating their speed and trajectory and then launching an interceptor at a point in space where that target will be by the time that interceptor arrives, a lot like a quarterback leading a wide receiver. So by adjusting course after the interceptor's been launched, the weapon can avoid intercept while closing too quickly to give air defenders another try. But again, warfare is complicated, and even some modern maneuvering hypersonic missiles are already considered susceptible to intercept by incredibly nimble surface-to-air interceptors like the Navy's SM-6 and air-launched AIM-174. And with significant investments placed in fielding other forms of hypersonic missile defense, it is really only a matter of time before these all but indefensible weapons become just another tool in the warfighting toolbox that, once again, is only really effective when used at the right time against the right kinds of targets. And that leads to the other myth in this 2-for-1 deal, the idea that hypersonic missiles aren't useful, either because Patriot systems in Ukraine have already been shooting Russia's down, or because they're too expensive to actually use. Now, the Russian missile part is easy to dispel because the Kinzhal missiles Patriot systems have been shooting down aren't actually modern hypersonic weapons at all. They're just good old-fashioned and predictable ballistic missiles that Russia called hypersonic because, well, technically speaking, all ballistic missiles since World War II do achieve hypersonic speeds during their descent. They basically just confused people who didn't understand the difference between a speed classification and a weapon category. As for the immense cost of these weapons, well, There is a fair bit of truth at the heart of this myth, as some original estimates for American hypersonic missiles in development exceeded $100 million a shot. But the prices of these systems are continuing to come down, and even at an extraordinary price point, there still may be pretty viable use cases for weapons like these, like using a $100 million missile to sink a multi-billion-dollar warship. And our next two myths are also something of a two-for-one. This time, it's the myth that lasers will replace air defense interceptors, and the myth that lasers will replace missiles for offensive strikes. And as luck would have it, we can point to the same reasons to disprove both. Now, lasers, or directed energy weapons, absolutely have a place on the modern battlefield, but for the most part, they're pretty likely to be relegated to close-in air defense against mortars, rockets, and targets like that, or longer-ranged, dazzling effects meant to blind or confuse electro-optical or infrared sensors on drones, aircraft, or weapon guidance systems like missiles. Now, it is very unlikely that we'll have lasers capable of shooting a hypersonic missile out of the air, or capable of striking a target from hundreds of miles out, as long as we're fighting inside the Earth's atmosphere. The biggest limitations facing lasers for either offensive or defensive purposes are line of sight, atmospheric scattering, and thermal blooming. Now, line of sight is just what it sounds like. Lasers travel in a straight line, and that means you can't hit something with them that's beyond the horizon, which usually isn't all that far. At sea level, the horizon is usually less than 5 miles away, and to hit a target that's more than 20 miles out, well, your laser would need to be positioned about 100 meters above sea level. Even a laser positioned on top of Mount Everest would only have line of sight out to about 230 miles. But line of sight is a walk in the park to overcome compared to atmospheric dissipation and thermal blooming. Water vapor, sand, salt, smoke, air pollution, and just about everything else found in the atmosphere all has a scattering effect on laser beams. This atmospheric turbulence is such a serious problem that the Pentagon currently sees lasers as viable only at ranges of under a mile. And even optimistic projections for the near future still only think lasers will be viable at ranges of less than 5 or maybe 10 miles. And then you still need to contend with thermal blooming. As a laser continues to fire in the same direction, it heats up the air that it's passing through, which creates a lensing effect that can defocus that laser beam, or even shift it off course. Meaning not only do laser beams get weaker, but they get less accurate at longer distances during prolonged firing. At the end of the day, lasers will make an excellent CIWS type of close-in air defense system with near-bottomless magazines, but they won't be used for long-range engagements of really any kind for a very long time to come, maybe not until we're fighting in orbit. And finally, our last myth is a bit of an all-encompassing one, and it can often be one of the most frustrating to contend with when you're doing defense analysis online. And that is the idea that a military can either be facing serious problems or it can be capable on the battlefield, but not both at once. Anytime I post a video or article about challenges facing the American defense apparatus, I receive dozens of comments treating those challenges like they're the death knell of the Republic, rather than part of the never-ending balancing act that is defense acquisitions and getting the political support for it. Whenever someone highlights Russia's glaring strategic failings throughout the past 4 years of combat operations against Ukraine, they'll get flooded with commenters claiming it can't be true because Russia is still gaining territory, even if very slowly. If we discuss the ongoing purge of Chinese military officials, I know a good portion of those watching will interpret that to mean China's military apparatus is too disorganized to be a threat. If not good, then bad, and people just seem to want to leave it at that. But military forces are vast organizations made up of millions of people and countless ongoing programs, avenues of effort, and long-term strategies. Today's vulnerabilities become tomorrow's strengths, and without careful planning and investment, today's strengths can easily become tomorrow's vulnerabilities. And that is the rat race being run by every military force on the planet. The winners of a large-scale conflict or war aren't decided by a single platform, or a single capability, or a single program, or even a single policy decision. Wars are won through the creative use of what's available and the efforts of the individual, compounding across the battlefield and around the world. And we cannot always predict how systems will perform or how training will manifest until it's really tested in the fight. That is to say that we don't know how the next war will play out, so naming the winners and losers of it today, based on the trending outrages on social media, is always an exercise in futility. And with that, ends yet another edition of Firepower from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and merch from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below, and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.